You're listening to The Human Upgrade with Dave Asprey. You're listening to The Human Upgrade with Dave Asprey.
Guys, this is Dan Buettner, the Blue Zones guy. Dan has written a really influential book by going around and saying, well, where are there pockets of long-lived people and what do they do? What can we learn from that? And I thought it was a really cool approach. So it's about time we have a conversation. So thank you for coming on the show.
I'm delighted. And so if I could just put a finer point on the introduction, I write for National Geographic. It's one of the hats I wear. But for the Blue Zone project, it wasn't so much about me. I led a very big team of people. The first team of experts we used were demographers, and we literally parsed through worldwide census data to identify demographically confirmed areas where people are living measurably longer. So it wasn't just sort of the hearsay of Vilcabamba Valley or Hunza Valley of Pakistan. These were real places that we, before we even began to guess at what these people are doing, we confirmed their ages with a pre-expedition. We found 5 of these blue zones. And then I brought another wave of experts. They're mostly epidemiologists, anthropologists, medical researchers. And the theory was, because only about 20% of how long we live as a population in the developed world is dictated by genes, the other 80% is something else. Based on that assumption, then we went to all 5 of these areas, and I've been doing it now for 20 years to find the common denominators or the correlates, the things that seem to be happening in all 5 blue zones. And from that, distill some insights on how we might be able to live longer. And the value proposition I have, Dave, is not that, I don't pretend people can live to 120. I think we're a ways from that. Theoretically, I think we can. But the average maximum life expectancy of the human species at the current level of science in the developed world is about 95.
What does average max mean? Like, what does that mean for 95?
That means if we did everything right, and you're an average person, we should be able to make it to 95. The average person could make it to 95.
Okay.
Well, but remember, you have outliers at one extreme, or who will run marathons and take all the right vitamins and be dead at 50 by some weird cancer. And then you have people who can drink a fifth of liquor and smoke cigarettes and they make it to 100. And but those are tiny fraction. But most of us within 2 standard deviations of the mean. The capacity of our human machine right now is 95. The potential, and I know your work pushes those boundaries. And theoretically, I think it's possible, but we're not seeing it yet.
I absolutely hear what you're saying. Today, if you just kind of do some of the stuff and you live an average life, that's there. And I have zero evidence that 180, which is my my minimum acceptable goal, is the right number. All I did is I looked at, when I look at our outliers, we've got probably 120 as the oldest living human. And by the way, is that a real number? Do you believe that one?
Yeah. Marie Calmé, yes, I do. I know there's some controversy that she may have been assuming her daughter's identity. She made it to 122 in 5 months and marked the outer limit. But you look at the number of supercentenarians, the people who make 110, or it's not growing as a proportion of the population. So we fall off an exponential cliff.
It's somewhere around 110 or 120. And all I did is I said, I want to do 50% better than our best outlier today and use a whole bunch of technology and every other learning that we have and see what happens. And, there's a great chance that I'll die trying, but I'm going to have fun doing it and hopefully learn a few things, right? I didn't see a lot of downside for that kind of a goal.
And there isn't. And by the way, you can make it. And if you look at, life expectancy for American men in 1900 was 40. We're now up to about 75, which is almost a doubling. So, if we double it again, your 180 is definitely within reach. But it's probably by a technology or intervention, we may be lurching towards it, but we don't know what it is yet. The big reason we're living so much longer now is because of penicillin and vaccines. That created the biggest, because what used to kill us, before about 1930 was infectious disease. You'd step on a nail and you'd be dead in 2 weeks. Most people who died in World War I died of infection, not of bullet wounds. And penicillin came along, and all of a sudden, boom, we had a way to deal with a lot of the infectious diseases, and then antibiotics. You couldn't have foreseen that somebody would, discover orange mold and the connection between that and increasing our immunity. Likewise, there'll probably be some genetic intervention, some CRISPR overture, which may add that. But my work, Dave, mostly focuses on, all right, these are real people living right now who are living about 10 years longer than we are, biologically younger at every decade, probably a decade younger than their chronological age. And they're suffering a fifth the rate of heart disease, a tenth the rate of diabetes, in one case, about a tenth the rate of dementia. So I'm saying, okay, here are these real people. What are they doing to achieve a healthy age, 95, occasionally 100? And then, if the intervention comes along in our lifetime, you'll be ready for it. Your body, because the first interventions will probably just slow aging, not reverse it. So you want to be in as best shape you can right now.
And that's kind of a Ray Kurzweil approach. What Ray's perspective is that, singularity is here. You just have to last long enough. And, there's a bunch of people on that kind of a train. You're going to upload yourself to the internet and live forever that way. And do you think that's a kind of life extension? Are you into that?
Not really.
Going to freeze your head when you die?
I think I'll do that, actually.
You are? Are you on the list? Is that like a necklace for the head freezers?
I haven't known. This is a necklace for a coin I found in Jerusalem.
Oh, cool.
But I think the best chance that, you can be reincarnated is to freeze yourself. Much better chance than, I think, cremation or, having the worms take you over. So that's kind of a fun way to do it. I have several friends who are doing that right now. I feel like I'm far enough away from death that I haven't really started making arrangements yet, but who knows?
That is so interesting. It's a rare treat to be able to talk with another radical long-term life thinker and to be able to go deep on stuff like that.
I wrote a cover story for National Geographic also on happiness in a book called The Blue Zones of Happiness, where I took a data-based approach to what drives happiness. And most of what brings true happiness, what people think bring true happiness, is misguided or just plain wrong. But one of the happy coincidences of the blue zones, longest lived women are in Okinawa, longest lived men are in the highlands of Sardinia, the island of Ikaria, Greece, off the coast of Turkey, the Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica, and among the Seventh-day Adventists. Those places are in the top quintile of the happiest places. So unlike sort of, these Silicon Valley billionaires who are, super busy and spending all their money on these heroic interventions and metformin and testosterone, and none of which, by the way, have proven to stop slow or reverse aging, and there's some controversy. The methods or the insights that I've harvested from Blue Zones are not only getting these people an extra 10 years, but they're also happy. And so, in the same way that you're taking this sort of 180-year approach to, or afterlife approach that also makes you happier right now, we share that I guess, parallel philosophy.
We do. And happiness matters so much that most people, if you were to say, do you want 90 happy years or 100 shitty years? They're going to say, I want 90 happy years. So it's almost the opposite of the Amazon selling strategy. It's about quality over quantity. But if you can get both, you'd like both. But buying a whole bunch of cheap crap it's not a very good strategy for the environment or for your house or for anything else. And That's why I think there's a rebellion against cheap plastic disposable crap. You don't want a cheap plastic disposable life either. And so I love it that you're studying what they're doing.
Well,
Have you ever?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm just saying that longevity and happiness right now are so interlaced, you can't pull the two apart, really. The same things that are driving longevity also drive happiness. Getting enough sleep, having a sense of purpose, being socially connected, and having low stress. These things, they go hand in hand. In fact, we know that if you can manage your life to be in the top quintile of the highest levels of subjective well-being or life satisfaction, it's worth about 6 years of life expectancy over being in that bottom six. So, one of the best longevity tonics is happiness, and there are lots of things we know that you can do that stack your deck in favor of happiness.
In fact, one of the best definitions of hell you could have is to say an unhappy, very long life, right? Like,
Yeah,
why would you want that? So you make a great point about happiness. Have you ever done work with Dean Ornish, like the super low fat guy?
He's a good friend of mine.
So when he did his original work, he said, well, guys, we're going to do lifestyle and meditation interventions and a diet, right? But then he talks about the diet as having caused the changes, even though it looks like lifestyle and meditation and other studies had the same changes he was ascribing to the diet. Like he had the mix of those two so intermingled that statistically it was hard to prove that eating, a very high starch, high sugar, low fat diet was causative for that. In your happiness books or happiness research, how do you break apart the value of community, strong social structure, getting enough sleep from all the other variables like the sunshine angle of the sun, minerals in the water? I mean, it could be anything. It's a conundrum for all anti-aging research.
You look for correlations. The way that the happiness research, which is done worldwide, largely by Gallup, but also the Latino Barometer and the Eurobarometer, they ask people to imagine themselves on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being their best imaginable life and 1 being their worst. And then they ask them 75 other questions about how often they socialize and the level of their health, their BMI, their religion, their income level, their sex, their age, et cetera, et cetera. And then through regression analysis, which I'm sure you're familiar with, you can find out exactly what things most strongly correlate with people reporting a very high level of happiness. And when you do that at a worldwide level, you get a pretty strong correlation. And I don't try to draw a causative relationship between these two. I like to phrase it in stacking the deck. So something that's very highly correlated with high life satisfaction, if you do it, there's no downside to it, but it stacks, it puts more aces in your life's blackjack deck, and that you too will and some of those things we know that work are having 5 good friends you can count on a bad day. The quality of your social interactions and connections, the number one driver by a margin of how happy you are. So when you say to yourself, well, I want to be happy, should I go out and read a bunch of positive psychology books, or should I take a Tony Robbins class, or should I work my ass off and make another $100,000 this year? Knowing that none of those will significantly add to your long-term happiness starts to drive you towards maybe things that do, like, being generous and remembering your friend's birthday and really nurturing friendships. I mean, that's the stuff that really works. And I can't sell you anything, and marketers don't necessarily seize that because there's not a lot of money in it, but we know, statistically speaking, it's one of the strongest things you can do.
Right. Just having those connections. And yeah. It's funny when you're looking at kind of, I don't know if isolated pockets is the right word, but in your research, you came across intact communities that kind of had defined boundaries. So you could find where the super centenarians are, like these very
Well, I
long lived.
want to stop you there because I get in trouble with the. We don't assert there are more super centenarians there.
Okay.
What we found areas that has the lowest rate of middle age mortality. In other words, they're hitting that age, healthy age 95 without chronic disease. A fifth the rate of chronic disease that we suffer. And necessarily, because more people are hitting that 95, there's also more people bleeding into their hundreds. So I'm not saying that these people have a greater physical capacity or greater genes than us. They're living a longer time because they're avoiding the diseases that foreshorten our lives.
Now, some of the in fact, almost everything that I've heard about you from the research I've done just over the years has been that you were sort of targeting people who lived a long time. But from the beginning, the target was just to find like a higher health standard in middle age, but it wasn't to find people who are living longer. That's just kind of sensationalism from the press.
Well, I mean, there are places that live it. People live 10 years longer, but it's not an obsession with centenarians. And
Got it. That wasn't the target.
That wasn't the target. But, not coincidentally, in Okinawa, you have a population of it's especially the women, not the men in Okinawa, but for women over 60, that cohort, you'll find about 30 times more of them reach age 100 than a similar cohort in the United States. And in Sardinia, they have about 10 times more male centenarians per 1,000 people or per 100,000 than you would expect to see in a similar population in the United States. But that's just because they're not dying younger. They're not prematurely dying of heart disease, diabetes, certain types of cancer, and dementia.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. For our listeners, what did you find? Like what are these people doing to live longer? You don't think it's genetic because you have multiple pockets around the world. So is it like 50% diet, 50% happiness? Is it, 70-30? Like what's the secret formula?
Well, I'll talk about diet in a minute. And,
Sure.
I have this new book, The Blue Zone American Kitchen, which I'd like to talk about. But
Oh yeah, in fact, I've got it. I should grab my copy. It's right over there. I unpacked it. I found it.
yeah. Yeah. So, okay, bottom line, in none of these blue zones do people try to live a long time. None of them are pursuing diets. There's not gyms. There's not exercise programs. They're not calling 800 numbers to buy supplements. They just live their lives. But the big insight is they don't pursue health and longevity, but rather it ensues. Their micro decisions on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis are marginally better. So they're nudged into moving every 20 minutes or so because they live in environments where every time they go to work or a friend's house or out to eat, it occasions a walk. They have gardens out back, like I know you do. I was watching your great kale ornament video today. Their houses aren't full of mechanical conveniences, so they're still doing housework by hand and kitchen work by hand and yard work by hand. The option to be lonely isn't there because if you're not showing up to church or the local party, somebody's pounding on your door. The cheapest, most accessible, and most socially accepted food over time, and by the way, the most delicious has been whole food, plant-based. I'll unpack the diet a little bit more, but that's mostly what we've been eating. And purpose comes with mother's milk. There's vocabulary for purpose. So you were talking about the corrosive nature of stress. For a lot of Americans, it comes from waking up every morning and not knowing what you're going to do with your life, or if there's somebody going to take care of you. This isn't an issue in blue zones because you have a strong sense of purpose and you're surrounded by a family that's going to take care of you till you're 105. So these are the things that I assert we can learn from, and we ought to be paying attention to. Not only if you have a family and you want your family to thrive, but also if you're a government and you're interested in lowering healthcare costs and raising the general well-being of the people who voted you into office.
And as I mentioned before we started rolling, I just moved to Austin. I've been in this house for like 6 days. So my laptop stand is a cardboard box. My backdrop is a white wall, but I do have your book,
Thank you.
is The Blue Zone's American Kitchen, which is cool. And just as a fellow author, congrats. It's always like giving birth to have to write a new book. There's just so much that goes into it, which is really cool. So 100 recipes to live to 100. So tell me your dietary philosophy. You mentioned whole foods, plant-based. I'm going to want you to define that a little bit more.
Yeah, and then I'll connect it to the book you're holding there. So, as part of a National Geographic project, we did a meta-analysis. So if you want to know what a centenarian ate to live to be 100, you can't just say, what have you been eating? Because
they don't even know.
Jay, they don't remember. If I asked you what you ate a week ago Tuesday for lunch, you might not be able to tell me. In order to ascertain that, we found 155 dietary surveys done in all 5 blue zones over the past 85 years. And then we did a meta-analysis, or sort of a worldwide averaging. So if you look at their traditional diets, they're eating mostly whole food, plant-based, about 65% complex carbohydrates, not simple carbohydrates. And the 5 pillars of every blue zone diet are whole grains, greens, tubers like sweet potatoes, nuts, and then beans. And if you're eating a cup of beans a day, that's associated with about 4 extra years of life expectancy. They did eat meat, but only about 5 times per month on average. So my philosophy begins and stops with, all right, here are the manifestly longest of people. Here's the way they've been eating. This might be something you want to pay attention to. And I don't get involved with sort of the micronutrients or trying to deconstruct the nutrients in each of those general food categories. But I do, over 20 years of seeing these people and eating with them, I'm of the strong opinion that that's correct. That's directionally correct as a way to eat.
I ended up writing my big diet book like a dozen years ago. And I found out that legumes, beans, were causative, and so were nightshade vegetables, were causative problems for me. And I wrote about lectins. And then later, Dr. Gundry, who you probably have met, because he worked in Loma Linda with one of the blue zones, but he also came out like me saying, I think beans, even though the fiber is good in them, the anti-nutrients are so strong that they're causing problems in the population he worked with. And so I'm genuinely scratching my head going, all right, Dan, I hear what you're saying. But when I try and do it, it destroys my quality of life. What could be going on there?
Well, 2 things. You're an N of 1. And secondly, these, I don't know if you cook beans and then rinse them, you get rid of the vast majority of lectins. If you eat kidney beans and crunch them. So I don't necessarily buy the lectin argument. But really, I'll just stop and end with, if it is indisputable that the longest lived populations are eating lots of beans throughout their lives and producing much better health outcomes than we are in America. I cannot tell you if it's because of the beans for sure. I can't tell you if there's something else in their diet that's explaining their longevity, but I can tell you a major feature of every diet of longevity, including, by the way, Loma Linda. So I'm not sure, if Gundry looked at the Adventist Health Study, which followed 103,000 Adventists for 30 years, he would see a ton of beans in their diet. So I'm not sure how he discerned that beans were somehow bad for the people living in Loma Linda. But I don't like drawing a causative. I can't say beans cause a long life, but I can say beyond a shadow of a doubt, people are living a long time, have eaten a lot of beans throughout their lives.
What does a whole foods plant-based diet mean? Like how do I know if it's a whole food? Because I know that I take the shell off my walnut, for instance. So that's already processed to a certain point. How do I know, like, do I eat the skin of the edamame or do I just eat the inside? Like what does whole food mean the way you use it?
Well, it's a single ingredient food. I guess that's a good place to start. If you read the label and there's only one ingredient, there's nuances there, but it grows, and so it's taken out of the ground or it's plucked off a tree or a plant. But it avoids it doesn't have added sugar. I think is a really important component to it. It doesn't have ingredients you can't pronounce. It doesn't have emulsifiers, or to your point, it's not ground down too much. Like if you overgrind even whole wheat, it's not as healthy as if you grind it less. Your smoothie is healthier if you don't overblend it, and it's still a little bit chunky because your glycemic load is. I took a lesson from the Sardinian Blue Zone. I start my day every day with a really, really chunky minestrone, and it's very, very low glycemic, so it absorbs very slowly. Your microbiome loves it because there's about 40 different species of fiber in there. You have about 1,000 species of bacteria. They like a variation of fiber. Full of vitamins, full of soluble fiber and the chunky stuff. So I don't get a spike like I would if I started my day with cereal. I don't get bogged down like I would if I ate bacon and eggs for breakfast. That's how I start my day, and it's all whole foods, just happen to be cooked together. And it's delicious, by the way.
It sounds delicious. I'm just thinking that if I ate that, I would have a food baby. I would have arthritis for a week because of the nightshades, and I am nightshade sensitive. And about a quarter of people appear to be, like 28% of rheumatoid arthritis is caused by the nightshade family. And I'd be farting all the time. And I'd be radically hungry after I ate that. Like I would just be like, my body wants me to eat sugar right now to help deal with the load of inflammation it just got.
I think the pursuit of finding what works for you and your considerable contribution to that body work is very important. So by no means would I say, eat this way because it's worked for centenarians around the world. It has to work for you. But I will say when it comes to microbiome, usually the best way, if you're feeding your microbiome, the 100 trillion or so bacteria in your gut, meat, cheese, and eggs, a certain type of bacteria blooms and it dominates. And then the next day, if they've been eating if they've been fed ribeye every day, and then all of a sudden you eat a cup of beans, yeah, you might get farty. But, the way to train it is to start with a teaspoon or a tablespoon of beans and day one, and then 2 tablespoons, and then work your way up to a cup. But,
You'll get less farty that way. It didn't stop the joint issues for me, but it did stop the farty issues. I mean, I love refried beans. I used to eat them a lot when I was younger, but I don't because of just kind of dialing in the personal precision. So thank you for sharing that tidbit. You put something else in your book I wanted to compliment you on. This is a page that says regional and contemporary American. You actually drove through the country, went on a road trip, and you talk about Appalachian food, coastal food, Persian, Japanese. It's pretty cool that you're teasing out what's happening in the real world that's still based on eating real food that's single ingredient, which I like a lot about your approach there. It is a way more natural approach than the Pop-Tarts diet.
So if I could just say, the idea behind the Blue Zone American Kitchen, Well, from what I discerned from the longest lived populations, I did come up with a dietary pattern. And then I worked with an NYU researcher to find subcultures in America that followed this same dietary pattern. And we found it among the African, Asian, Latin, and Native Americans living around 1900, 1920. And then I found during the pandemic, while other people were locking down, I took a National Geographic photographer and a Sprinter van, and we went from Maine to Miami to Maui and then up to Minnesota. And we found 55, I would say, heritage chefs who either are bringing back this traditional way of eating. It's usually immigrants, by the way, fusing the way they did things in the old country and new country influences, and then who could recreate these. An important thing to remember, Dave, is we evolved as a species eating this kind of food. So, by the way, in blue zones, they're not vegan except for some Adventists. They love meat, and by the way, if they're given all the meat they want, they'll eat it all the time. In fact, we're seeing this in Sardinia, and not coincidentally. And they're also eating a lot more processed food. And almost every blue zone is disappearing as their dietary pattern starts to mimic, the standard American diet. So, what I think we can both agree on is the standard American diet. The way we're eating right now is killing us. Probably, I wrote an essay in the front of that book, Blue Zone American Kitchen, which will also appear in January's issue of National Geographic. But according to the CDC, about 680,000 Americans will die this year prematurely because of the way we eat. And it doesn't have to be like that. Way more people had died eating the standard American diet than have died in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam War combined. Yet we don't spend nearly as much effort and time trying to fix that as we do, with the Veterans Administration. Of course, people who give their life for our country, they need to be recognized. I'm just saying we ought to be focusing on this other big problem, killing more of us.
Completely agree. I mean, look at our reaction over the last couple of years to something that is a tiny drop in the bucket compared to what's happening every year from preventable problems driven by nutrition. Some stuff has come out around from Oxford saying that in the US, you can predict that there's going to be extreme longevity when there's an absence of vital registration. In other words, if they didn't have birth certificates, there's magically a lot more older people.
Yes, I know that.
Yeah, I'm sure you've come across the research. I'm going to explain it just a little bit for listeners and just tell me what's going on with this, because I think you're a smart guy. I think your heart's in the right place. I think you're doing the right thing. And it looks like from this paper, and there's a couple others, they're saying poverty, old age poverty, material deprivation, low income, high crime, remote region of birth, worse health in the general population, and fewer and other things like that predicted remarkable longevity. You're saying you're not looking at remarkable longevity, but what these guys are finding is that a lot of the areas that you've looked at, they have weird distributions of people where it looks like some people might have faked their birth certificates to avoid inheritance taxes. So you must have thought about this. You must have read the papers. Tell me your take on all this.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. When there's not birth certificates, there's always age exaggeration. I write for National Geographic, where the fact checkers occupy the corner office. And before we even published one word, we spent 3 years in every one of the blue zones checking birth certificates. So there's a birth certificate, and not only checking the birth certificates, in many cases verifying it by looking at the baptismal record. And a demographer named Michel Poulin did that work. So we have a very firm base on all blue zones. They have very good birth records. In fact, better birth records in Costa Rica, for example, than in the United States. We're all, make it very easy in Costa Rica. When you're born, you're given a sequential number. So it's kind of impossible to, lie about your age, because you're born, you're given this, an ID number that is the guy who was born 5 minutes before you gets a lower number, and the guy born 5 minutes after you gets a higher number. So you can't all of a sudden say what was the other problem or whatever. Okay, right, poverty. So
right.
Two things. First of all, in every one of the blue zones, they're deteriorating. The way people are living today was not the way they were living in the year 2000, or even 2010. And my work was mostly synthesizing studies that have been done in these blue zones up to about the year 2000, because then things changed. And so if you look at Okinawa of today, Okinawa in the year 2000 had the longest lived population in the history of the world. That was according to the World Health Organization, published paper. In 2020, they have the highest rates of obesity and diabetes, and actually the lowest health of any prefecture in Japan. So if a demographer or if one of these people writing the paper goes to Okinawa today and looks at them, of course, they're going to draw, what the hell? These blue zones are a bunch of BS. But we captured a population that lived longer than any other human, and then capture what was done in a human lifetime in those populations. So that's where most of my work is done. In Sardinia and Costa Rica, the blue zones persist, as they do among the Seventh-day Adventists.
So you're saying that you did adequate work to validate the birth certificates of the people you were looking at. And just having known your work from afar and your reputation amongst people who know you personally, because the number of people who are doing longevity work is not that large, like real hardcore longevity work. You have a stellar reputation. Your motivations are exactly in the right place. And I greatly respect that. And so I'm willing to believe you where you say, okay, we validated this to the extent possible. And like, there's a whole bunch of people who've gone back and all this, and there's actually a whole group of it's a tribe that behaves kind of like the people who do the editing on Wikipedia. It's a group of like kind of insular, kind of arguing to see who's right sort of things, who will go in and try and validate stuff like that. So you went down the path with your populations and you came up with these results. And I'm mystified because I didn't come up with these results when I look at it mechanistically. But I'm still intrigued by your work and your perspective on it. So thanks for answering the question. How long are you going to live?
Well, if you look at the trends, life expectancy since about 1840 has gone up 2 years per decade. And I think I do all the right things. I get enough physical activity. I'm socially active. I don't have a lot of stress in my life. I don't smoke. I believe a whole food, plant-based diet with very little animal products is the way to go. I eat that way. So if you look at the life tables for me, my life expectancy should be about 92. But I'm in my 60s right now, and if I get that extra 2 years per decade that we see historically, I should hit 100. And
100.
I may be around for one of some heroic intervention that you're closer to than I am, that may just come along and extend my life another, I don't know, 100 years.
Do you run like anti-aging or age measurement lab tests? Do you know your true age? Have you had stem cells? Any of the
No, I don't believe. I think there's more danger in those things than there are upside, actually. Especially stem cells. Mike Roizen just wrote a great book called The Great Age Reboot, and he's the Cleveland Clinic, and he wrote a great book about those interventions and really outlines the dangers of them, as well as the promise. So there's some danger with those interventions.
It's really interesting because some of the things that are strongest in favor of a very low meat diet comes down to a couple amino acids, and you don't get into the mechanistics, but I do. And if you're eating Animal protein, specifically methionine, which is an amino acid that's more common in animal protein, and tryptophan. These things will raise a compound called mTOR. And the theory goes that if you have more of those, then mTOR, which causes growth in tissues, would be higher, and therefore your cancer risk would be higher. And that's one of the reasons intermittent fasting seems to be important. And I think you'll also find a fasting practice is common in a lot of your blue zones as well.
It's not a practice. It was an involuntary.
Okay. Forced intermittent fasting.
Yeah.
Okay.
They did real fasting. Every one of the blue zones, I'd say, suffered a fast. But you're right. Fasting was part of their history.
So it's this interesting puzzle. It's like a big Rubik's Cube. I don't know if we're ever going to solve it all for everyone, because there's probably individual stuff here. There are some people where, like, Dave, I tried it, I don't feel good. And there are many other people who say, yes, I tried it, I feel good. It's not going to be the same for everyone. But the principles of fewer toxins, don't eat ultra processed foods, I think we're in very firm agreement on that one, Dan.
Yes, I violently agree. The processed food is at the core, and probably sugar, refined sugars. I think those two things are the number one and number two scoundrels in our diet. And the other stuff, it's fine too.
What about seed oils like canola and soy and corn? Are those better than sugar or worse than sugar in terms of your?
It's hard to say, but they're not good.
Yeah.
I only use olive oil.
Yep. One of the things that blew me away as I was going through your recipes in here, you had a crust. Of course, it had gluten in it that I'm not a fan of. You had a crust that was made out of tallow.
I think you probably found the only animal product in there. And I had the, I try to be journalistically honest about these things. This was a food archaeologist who recreating a Thanksgiving, an early 17th century meal.
Yeah.
Those they didn't have coconut oil there. That's why I put coconut oil as the alternative. People in blue zones did eat meat. They did eat cheese. They did eat some butter. Well, not really butter, not cows, more sheep and I guess the
sheep and goat. It's because sheep and goat are cheaper. Those are more poverty animals than cows.
Yeah, almost no cows in any blue zones. But my main work, Dave, I get hired by insurance companies. I have a company of 200 people, and we go into cities and we help change the environment rather than changing people's behaviors. And when you're dealing with talking to whole populations of people, you can't be. It's hard to be nuanced. You have to be very simple. And for the Blue Zone brand, I've made the decision that we only promote whole food, plant-based. We know people are going to get meat in their everyday life, but when eating sort of the Blue Zone's way, we put forth the whole food, plant-based, knowing that people might slip some cheese or some butter or some meat in these recipes. But the base recipes taste maniacally delicious, and they're 100% whole food, plant-based. They take less than a half hour to make, and they are the core of the longevity diets from around the world.
So if the populations in these areas ate as much meat as they could get, they just didn't have very much meat, and they were eating it 5 times a month on average, and probably some months during the end of the season when you're going to harvest an animal or something, they ate more then because they didn't.
Correct.
It was done seasonally. With all of that stuff, are you a little concerned that which would have been a precious food to them is just missing from a whole food plant-based diet?
Well, their meat consumption has quintupled, and at the same time, their chronic disease rates have skyrocketed, and their life expectancy has plummeted. Now, again, that's just a correlation. Yeah. And also, what's also entered their diet is a lot more processed food. So
they got jugs of corn oil at the same time they got more meat. That's always the confounding.
That's correct. That's correct. But it's hard to know what we do know that the standard American diet, which includes about 140 pounds of meat per person per year, and 220 pounds, 140 pounds of sugar per person per year, and these inflammatory oils. We know it's killing us. We know it's driving about 2 trillion. It's hard to know which of those components are doing the most damage. If you look at the Adventist Health Study, again, followed 103,000 Americans for 30 years, you see pretty clearly the people who are either 100% plant-based or eating some fish, the pescatarians, they're living the longest with the lowest rates of disease, and they also have the healthiest weight. They weigh about 20 pounds less. So there's probably some epidemiology study that shows that people who eat a lot of meat are healthier. I'm not aware of it, but your specialty, and you're a lot better at it than me, is knowing these sort of micronutrients and how they interact with our genes and our bodies. And I don't know that science as well as I know the population science. So I generally speaking, here's what these populations do. I think we both agree that it's smarter to try, different foods that work best for us, but, pay attention from both camps of research and draw your own conclusions because it's your life.
You're totally right. It is your life. And I've run the gamut because I very much have tried all these different diets to find what worked. And I would have rather not written a diet book, except I just realized I still believe that I found some gaps in our understandings that we could take advantage of around certain buttons that get pushed for certain people. And I'm always tormented because I'll see one paper that says one thing, and I'll see another paper that says the opposite thing.
Yeah.
Right? And so many people listening are so confused right now. Right. And the end of the day is you can tease out on some papers, if it's funded by an animal rights terrorist group, then maybe they didn't have health. They had manipulation of your behavior as part of their agenda. Or if it's funded by, the American Meat and Dairy Association, assuming there is such a thing.
The Cattlemen's Association.
Right. And so you can look at funding. And then at the end of the day, you can read through the papers if you have the knowledge and understanding to do that. And what I just found was for me to survive and even to thrive, I had to do that. And I was willing to do it. And I still see confounding papers. And then I look for, okay, was there a mistake? And then sometimes there's pockets of populations. There's so much we don't know. The fear of making a mistake nutritionally keeps a lot of people from stepping up. And what I want to say here is you look like you're reasonably healthy. You haven't run the anti-aging panels where we can compare numbers. And even if we did, you're an N of 1, I'm an N of 1, we're small studies. But everyone listening is a small study. Like, it's totally fine. Go eat a whole bunch of beans and see how it works.
And use a good recipe because I don't want to turn you off to them.
That's a fair point. Make sure that you don't just toss them in a pan, boil them, and eat them. And the same thing with rice. Like, you rinse it, you steam it. So there's nothing wrong with preparing foods to make them more nutrient available and less toxic for us. And that's a core part of human behavior forever. Knowing how to do that well for beans, it'd be really in your interests, right? I really appreciate your time, Dan. It was fantastic finally connecting with you. Thank you for the work you're doing and to tease out what works for people. Have a wonderful day. And guys, Blue Zones, American Kitchens, his new book.
Thank you very much, Dave. And I look forward to meeting you in Austin.
Yes.
And if you come to Miami, mi casa is tu casa.
Thank you. I'll come on over. As long as you don't mind a little meat in the corner of your fridge, we'll be good.
That's all right. We'll cordon off a section. Really a joy to meet you. And thank you for the lively conversation.
Thanks, my brother.
All right.
Have a great day.
You're listening to The Human Upgrade with Dave Asprey.